course will be continuing after Pesach. The course will be continuing after Pesach, and we will be picking up where we leave off, and you'll have some time between now and then to both review what we've looked at and to read ahead. I'll be happy to provide reading material and assignments for the break, for the intercession, as it were. If you have a video, hit the send video button so that we can see you. And tonight I want to talk a little bit about the French Revolution. There he is, good old Louis XVI, King of France. You remember that song from grade school, Louis XVI was the King of France in 1789. You can fill in the rest if you know it, and if you don't know it, you'll have to check with me afterwards for the rest of the lyrics. In France, and we're looking at France, and tonight we're going to have to do we're going to get to the Jewish history by way of looking at some major trends in general history, and this is really a case of it being impossible to study Jewish history without a solid grounding in a knowledge of without a solid grounding in knowledge of what's going on in Europe in general, independent of the Jews, as it were. Tehillah Leah, you get extra credit for the reference which you posted in the chat. Under the Ancien Regime, the old-fashioned way things used to be, that's a loose translation, the people of France were divided into three classes, or three estates. The first estate, you can see this handy chart, the first estate was the clergy, the second estate was the nobility, and the third estate was, well, essentially the third estate was everyone else. The third estate were everyone from the bourgeois, the middle class, peasants, workers, farmers, etc., etc., etc. You can see from some of the statistics here that the gross disproportions in how much of the population each estate made up. For example, the first estate made up 0.5%, and yet they owned 10% of the land. The nobility, the second estate, made up about 1.5% of the population, and they owned 20% of all the land in France. And the third estate, which made up about 98% of the population, they were crowded onto a mere 70% of the land. And that wasn't the only difference. The first estate, the clergy, they are essentially in charge of running the church, the schools. They're the scribes. They're not merely the priests. They fill a functionary role in the society. They collect a tax, a tithe, but they don't pay any taxes. And they own a tremendous amount of property in the country. The second estate, the nobility, have obviously tremendous wealth and power and privilege. They themselves are exempt from most taxes, and they own feudal lands that the members of the third estate, the peasants and the common farmers and workers, they are essentially tenants of the nobility, and they exact a heavy tax on those peasants, on the feudal renters, on the property of the second estate. And again, the third estate are subject to very heavy taxes. They resent the privileges, obviously, of the first two classes, and they have a sense, to whatever degree they're aware of these happenings, that the Enlightenment, we were speaking about the Enlightenment in the last session, that the Enlightenment has to mean some kind of social justice and equality for everyone. Tehillah, you ask, if the peasants were serfs to the others, how did they come to own so much land? They weren't only serfs. They weren't serfs in the sense of the serfs in Russia, which we'll talk about hopefully in the coming weeks. But they were feudal renters. But they weren't only. They were also, again, the shopkeepers. They were the merchants. They were the other people. So there were other ways for people to own land. But again, it's greatly out of proportion, not just to get on land ownership, but on taxation. In the 1770s, there's an economic crisis in France. The economic crisis that the United States is undergoing in these past couple of years, and the economic crises that happen from time to time since the Depression, and let's say after the New Deal, you have to remember that nobody thinks that the government of the United States is going to be overthrown because of the banking crisis in America. Some people might want to overthrow the government, but nobody thinks that that's a realistic expectation. In the early modern and pre-modern era, that was not the case. This economic crisis in France in the 1770s is a function of a big national debt to bankers, monopolies on the guilds have monopolies on most of the manufactured goods, and this leads to a big inflation. The French, of course, were big supporters. They bankrolled the American Revolution. You remember the American Revolution? And that greatly overextended the French national debt. Louis XVI comes to the throne in 1774, and he has this idea that he's going to tax the nobility. He's going to tax the second estate. But in order to do that, he needs the approval of the French Parliament, who are not in favor of doing this because it obviously goes against their own self-interests. In 1787, 1788, there are poor crops and there are bread shortages, leading, of course, to Mrs. Louis XVI's famous comment. What was that? Who was she? Anyone recall? We'll let them eat cake. Correct, Marie Antoinette. If there was bread shortages, she says, let them eat cake. People did not really appreciate her sense of humor. So there are bread shortages and famine, etc. In 1788, Louis XVI summons the Estates Generales, the General Estates. It was a kind of representative assembly of all three estates. It's mostly for show, and this body, the Estates General, didn't really have much power and actually hadn't been called into session in like 175 years. But he calls them into session that they should meet in May of 1789 in order to do something. So what happens is that this assembly comes together. It includes, of course, representatives of the Third Estate. Louis XVI might have thought that it was kind of like for show. But what happened was, Hagolem Kamal Yosrav, as they say, I'm not sure what the equivalent English expression to that is, but you let the genie out of the bottle, and in June of 1789, the Third Estate declares itself the National Assembly and declares its intention to write a constitution. Basically, they say that we are the people, we the people. You remember that expression? France actually paid a lot of money to enable we the people across the ocean in America to create the democracy, and those ideas come back to bite Louis XVI, on the back, or on the backside. And these ideas, which are kind of out there in the ether, infect his own people. Um, uh, the the National Assembly, uh, um, tries to take over. In July, riots start breaking out, and the peasants in Paris storm the Bastille on July 14th, which is of course their National Day of Independence, Ad Hayom Hazeh. And this is an attack on the injustice and inequality of how the country had been run. Throughout that whole summer, riots spread throughout the countryside. Peasants revolt against the landlords. In August, the National Assembly revoked most of the feudal customs. They end the serfdom, and they end the tax-exempt privileges. In August, the end of August, they adopt the Declaration of the Rights of Men, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, which is kind of the equivalent of our Declaration of Independence. And it's actually inspired by the Declaration of Independence, although it's not really clear from the Declaration of Rights of Man where the Jew stands, whether this notion that all men are created equal, does that apply only to Christians? Does it include the Jew? In France, let's just look at this map. Here's a 1789 map of France. Let me just try to make it a drop bigger. In France, there were two major Jewish population centers. Let me just make this bigger. There you go. There's the map of France in 1789. In the southwest, in the communities of Bayonne and Bordeaux, down here, you had a Sephardic population. Again, Spain is right here. So you had a Sephardic population in the southwest of France, which was largely acculturated. These Jewish Frenchmen of Sephardic descent, they had a very, very high level of acculturation, if not assimilation. In the northeast, in the regions of Alsace and Lorraine, in an area which actually at different points goes back and forth from being part of France to being part of Germany, depending upon which morning the border is to the east or to the west. This is the large Ashkenazi population, which is largely a traditional community. In January of 1790, the acculturated Sephardim of the Southwest were given rights, and the decision on what to do with the traditional Ashkenazim, which was 80% of the Jewish population of France. Most of the Jews were these traditional Ashkenazim. Only about 20% of the Jewish population were the acculturated Sephardim. The decision on what to do with these traditional Ashkenazim, that was delayed. The National Assembly was not prepared to make a decision. The main part of the reason that the National Assembly can't immediately accept and extend rights to the Ashkenazim, to the traditional Jews, was frankly the resistance and the kind of ingrained anti-Semitism of the local peasants. Were there other? That's a good question. I don't know about other ethnic groups. Obviously, there were other ethnic groups, and how they were left in limbo. I don't know. I don't have a careful answer to that question. Ultimately, the Jews, the Ashkenazim of the northeast, were also emancipated in September 1791. So the Sephardim are given rights in January of 1790, and the Ashkenazim only in September of 1791. And from here, emancipation spreads throughout Europe with the advance of the French Revolution. In other words, the advance of the French army. France becomes a constitutional monarchy. This is important to remember. I had forgotten this, and it only kind of came back to me in reviewing some of this. It's important to remember, we talk about the French Revolution, July 14, 1789. That's not when Louis XVI gets his head chopped off. For a while, there's a period in which France is a constitutional monarchy, where the king is still technically on the throne, although he's had to cede much of his power. And France goes through another stage of revolution in 1792. There's a radical revolutionary group called the Jacobins. In English we call them the Jacobins. The Jacobins. It's a political party, a radical political party led by Maximilien Robespierre. Where is he? Let's find him. There he is. There's Maximilien Robespierre, and he seizes the government together with his party. They abolish the monarchy in 1792, in September 1792, and they make France a republic. In January of 1793, Louis loses his head, and by March, a band of 5 European nations who are very threatened by this idea that the masses can rise up and start chopping off the heads of kings. A group of 5 nations, Britain, Spain, Prussia, the Netherlands, and Austria, start waging war on France to prevent the spread of the revolution. Robespierre declared a state of emergency, which quickly morphs into what we call the Reign of Terror. This is a period of time from July of 1793 to July of 1794, and tens of thousands of people, maybe up to 40,000 people, although that estimate might be a little bit exaggerated, but maybe up to 40,000 people are guillotined for, suspicion of being enemies of the state. Ultimately, the National Assembly puts a break on this and stops Robespierre, and he, of course, meets his own end and is separated from his head as well. In 1795, another constitution is written, making another form of republican government, which is not so efficient and is also somewhat corrupt. In 1799, 10 years after the start of the revolution, a young army general named, here he is, named Napoleon Bonaparte. There's Napoleon, and his famous pose with the hand in his vest. Apparently he suffered from an ulcer, and that gave him some kind of comfort. And then here he is mounted on his horse. Extra credit for anyone that can tell us the name of his horse. No? Anyone? What's Napoleon's horse's name? horse. It's not named Horse. It's not Silver. It's Nicole. Napoleon's horse's name was Nicole. And if anyone can tell us, what what item Nicole's name was lent, what item Nicole's name was lent, you can get extra credit. So Napoleon Bonaparte overthrows this what's called the Directory. A fourth constitution of the revolution is written, and Napoleon becomes what's called the first consul, the leader of the republic. In 1804, however, he declares himself Emperor of France and actually, apparently, crowns himself. It used to be traditional that kings were crowned by the archbishop, the leading clerical figure in town, or the Pope himself, to show that the Melech Basar V'Dam, the earthly king, is subservient to the heavenly king, and that the royalty is in some way subservient to the clergy. Napoleon takes the crown and crowns himself in a highly symbolic move in 1804. He continues the reforms of the revolution, but keeps a very, very tight personal control over everything. The French army advances throughout most of Europe, and most of Europe comes underneath Napoleon's control. He dissolves the Holy Roman Empire, and by 1812, he controls everything from France up to, but not including, the borders of Russia. And every place that the French army extends, the ideas of revolution, including emancipation for the Jews, begins to spread. Now, that doesn't mean that every place the French army steps its foot, Jews are suddenly granted equal rights. But these ideas spread, and the question of the consistency of democracy, and that having to extend to the Jews as well, begins to be raised. Of course, during 1812, the winter of 1812-1813, he faces his ill-fated invasion of Russia. Many people, of course, discover that you don't wage an invasion of Russia in the winter. Thousands of French soldiers are freeze or are starved to death during that winter. The army can't hold back the attack of his enemies. Again, Britain, Austria, Russia, Prussia, and in March of 1814, he has to abdicate, and he goes into exile on the island of Elba. Let me just quickly kind of plow through the rest of European history here so that we can turn our attentions more to the Jewish question. The Allies install the brother of the executed Louis XVI as Louis XVII, but disturbances and tensions lead to Napoleon's return to Paris as emperor in March of 1815. But the European allies swiftly act to get rid of him, and he is, of course, defeated by the British in June of 1815 at where? Correct. Waterloo. At the Battle of Waterloo, he's again, interestingly, he's not executed, he's not killed, he's not killed in battle or afterwards. He's again sent into exile far away on the island of St. Helena, and he lives there in exile until 1821 when he dies. But even after Napoleon is off the stage, the kings and the nations and the princes and hundreds of diplomats converge in 1814, in the fall of 1814, in Vienna for a 10-month-long conference, the Congress of Vienna, to determine what post-Napoleonic Europe is going to be like. And again, there's this notion that you can't unscramble the egg. You can't put the genie completely back in the bottle. The Congress of Vienna wanted to restore the balance of power in Europe, wanted to redraw the boundaries, but the new boundaries and the new ideas about political and social justice that the Enlightenment and the French Revolution had brought could not be erased. They could not be completely wiped out. You could redraw boundaries, but you can't get rid of these notions which become entrenched into European society. The Congress of Vienna, in redrawing the map of Europe, overlooked the fact that you can draw lines however you want, but you can't ignore the people that live on those maps, and you can't ignore the feelings of nationalism, of pride and devotion to one's own country, and these ideas which are outgrowths of the Enlightenment. And this leads to a series of reactions to the Congress of Vienna and kind of hiccups, as it were, with a series of mini-revolutions throughout Europe, more in France and Austria and Italy and Germany, throughout the 1830s, leading up to a series of revolutions that take place in 1848. And these are all aftershocks of the French Revolution, and they are all fueled by the Enlightenment ideas, by a desire to do away with the monarchies. Most of these small revolutions are put down, but again, there's this notion that you can't unscramble the egg. And what we're going to do with these democratic ideas, and then as a subset of these larger questions, what role does the Jew play, which is, of course, our interest. This becomes the topic in Europe throughout the 19th century. There's a very nice book. Here, let me just... is Alan with us tonight? Alan, are you here? Oh, Alan, where are you? Maybe the time change did him in. This book called The French Enlightenment and the Jews, The Origins of Modern Anti-Semitism by Arthur Hertzberg, H-E-R-T-Z-B-E-R-G. It's published, at least the edition that I have, is published by the Columbia University Press. If somebody could just, Google it, I'm sure it's available on Amazon as well. If somebody wanted to do some background reading in the month or so that we're going to be on break over Pesach, this would be a really good book to get. I'm guessing that it's available in most good libraries, and certainly if you have access to any kind of college library, I'm sure it's there. It was first published in 1968, and then it was republished a number of times since. And this is a very, very good overview of the French Enlightenment and how the Jewish question grew out of that. So if you wanted some background on some of these larger questions, you could see that. You could also if you have a lot less time, you could read the Encyclopedia Judaica article on Emancipation or the French Revolution. And of course, for general, not for the Jewish perspective, but for the general reading, the article on the French Revolution in the Wikipedia and the article on the Enlightenment in the Wikipedia would be very helpful. I see on Amazon that the book is available. It sells for $38, but I also see that they're selling a used copy for $1.46. So for a book like this, there's really no reason not to order it used from Amazon. I've bought a number of books from Amazon, from the used books, and they've all been really fine. There's no reason that you can't buy a book from somebody that's pre-read, a pre-read book. So for $1.46 plus shipping and handling, you can get it from Amazon.com, or again, maybe from your own library. The debate about reforming the Jew. The debate about reforming the Jew is played out in France by a number of people. In that volume that I've used a number of times, the Mendes Floor volume, with the documents of modern Jewish history, they have very, very many very good primary sources on this debate about what do we do with the Jews. The notion that the modern democratic enlightened state is for the individual, this new idea of the people, we the people, that the people become the source of authority, not a king who rules with some kind of divine power. This leads to the question of definition. What is a citizen? Again, the document, the foundational document of the French Revolution is the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. But we have to define what is a citizen, and it's possible to imagine an array of answers to that question. Which have room for certain amount of, at best, contradiction and at worst, hypocrisy. So, for example, in the United States, the Declaration of Independence can talk about we the people and clearly exclude blacks. I mean, I want to call them I know it's more politically correct to refer to them as African Americans, but at the time they weren't African Americans since they were not citizens of America. That was the whole question, and certainly to a very large extent also to exclude women. In France and in Europe, the question of how does the Jew fit in after the revolution. The premise of that question, though, is that the degree to which we can be open, we, European society, can be open to admitting a Jew as a citizen or as a member of the state, or someone who is worthy and possesses rights, that envisions a new type of Jew, a reformed type of Jew, not to be confused with the Reform movement, the denomination of contemporary Judaism that we call Reform Judaism. That's a later phenomena. This is reform with a lowercase r, but it's the word that's used. How might we reform the Jew? How might we remake the Jew? Or how might the Jew remake himself that would allow us to admit him to citizenship, to a level of equality in our society, which is a little more palatable to us. And this is debated by the great thinkers of the French Enlightenment, of European society. We don't have time really to go through all of the different debates, but these debates about how the Jew might be admitted and how the Jew might be reformed, or how the Jew might reform or remake himself, is really very interesting. In reality, the revolution takes a kind of a middle road. A notion that there's nothing inherent about Judaism per se that conflicts with a Jew's admission to citizenship. But there's certain things that need to be either curtailed or restricted or overridden. The notion that the Jews regulate themselves through a kind of self-government, through Bet Din, through Beis Din, through Jewish courts. Now this is a terrible irony. For centuries, the Jews were in isolation, and they had to develop their own system of self-regulation, of enforcing their own laws and governing themselves, because the general society largely wanted to ignore them. Now that the question of how do we admit them to the general society, we're saying all of these things that keep them apart, that indicate that they're not fully part of our society, prevent them from being part of our society. So, for example, a question like Bet Din, how could it be that Jews have their own court system? It's not possible. It's not possible, the practitioners of the Enlightenment would say, because in order to be a citizen, that means that we are all judged in the same court, and therefore questions of the role and the authority, and even the existence of a Jewish Bet Din, of a Jewish court, becomes a central issue. Sitting across the border in Germany, Mendelssohn, you remember Mendelssohn? No, so this is a debate. This is a debate that's taking place on all levels. It's a debate that's taking place by the French, not the French officials per se, but the French philosophers, Voltaire and Montesquieu, and you know, the other leading lights of the French Enlightenment are debating this question. The Jews themselves are debating the question, and not just the Maskilim. What percentage of the population were Jews? I don't know, but a fairly small percentage. How many Jews were there in France? I will tell you. There were about 35 in 1789. There were about 35,000 Jews in 35,000 Ashkenazim, and that was 80% of the Jewish population. There were 35,000 non-acculturated, traditional Jewish Ashkenazim living in the northeast of France. It's a fairly small percentage, but again, they were very visible. They were very concentrated, and it was not something that could be easily swept under the carpet. The case of Voltaire is particularly interesting because Voltaire himself was not, by any stretch of the imagination, was not without anti-Semitic feeling, but yet he also understood that there were issues here, there were contradictions, there were hypocrisies that had to be that had to be worked out for there to be some kind of coherence in the revolution. Voltaire himself had a particularly negative and derogatory image of the Jew. There was an encyclopedia. A fellow named Diderot wrote an encyclopedia, which was a very interesting. It was the first real true, I think, the first real true encyclopedia, the way that we know it, the way like the Encyclopedia Britannica. You remember the Encyclopedia Britannica? Some of us are old enough to remember having seen one on a shelf. Now it's all just online, of course. This was a project of the Enlightenment, having nothing to do with emancipation and having nothing to do with the Jewish question, but it was an Enlightenment project, this idea that we could have an encyclopedia, that between two covers of a book or between two covers of a set of many books, we can kind of marshal all of the wisdom and knowledge of the world, and that this is a worthy project to undertake as part of the Enlightenment. This idea of dare to know, of aude sapere, of farming together all of wisdom as a resource. So in this encyclopedia, in Diderot's encyclopedia, Voltaire himself writes the entry on Jews. If you Google Voltaire and Jews and encyclopedia, or Diderot, D-I-D-E-R-O-T, I'm guessing you can even find what Voltaire writes there. But it's important to remember that Voltaire's anti-Judaism, not so much anti-Semitism, his anti-Judaism is he didn't like Judaism, but he didn't like any organized religion. His anti-Judaism is largely an outgrowth of his opposition to the church, which he sees Judaism as the father of, or as the precursor to. But these opinions, he's aware that these opinions create a contradiction to his general Enlightenment call for the brotherhood of man, and he's both used as an authority to bolster an anti-Semitic campaign for a couple of generations. But the irony, of course, is that it was Voltaire himself that helped create the enlightened atmosphere, which ultimately leads to the emancipation of the Jew. But at the same time, he also lays the groundwork for modern anti-Semitism. I think that Hertzberg in the book, The French Enlightenment and the Jews, deals with this. I'm pretty sure there's a chapter here just about Voltaire. Let me take a look. Yeah, there's a big entry on him in the index, and that's why the subtitle of Hertzberg's book is The Origins of Modern Anti-Semitism. Right, with the French Enlightenment and the Jews, but it paradoxically leads to modern anti-Semitism. But clearly it's Voltaire, as much as anyone else, that leads to the breakdown of this idea of the divine rights of kings, of the privileges of the nobility, of the infallibility of the church. So Voltaire's one of these figures, only one of these figures, but there are many others that are engaged in the thick of the debate. Sitting across the border in Germany, Mendelssohn, our old friend Mendelssohn, who you remember from a couple of sessions ago, he makes an argument that says that the Jew has to be emancipated unconditionally, has to be granted rights, because Jews are human beings, and all men are created equal, and Jews are men, and therefore everyone's entitled to equal rights, to equal protection under the law, to to the benefits of society, and anything less is a contradiction to the ideals of the Enlightenment. Napoleon himself, you know, and the Declaration of the Rights of Man here, the tenth clause in the Declaration of the Rights of Man is, no one shall be disquieted, meaning nobody shall be bothered, no one shall be beat up on account of his opinions, including his religious views, provided their manifestation does not disturb the public order established by law. In other words, as long as being a Jew doesn't interfere with your responsibilities as a Frenchman, or as a German, or as an Austrian, or as a fill in the blank, then you're entitled to practice your religion without any type of interference. These are ideas that you know, the notion of separation of church and state, of freedom of religion, these are ideas that anyone familiar with the American Bill of Rights, you know, is aware of. And here we have it in the Declaration of the Rights of Man. But the question is, does Judaism constitute a manifestation that disturbs public order? By disturbing public order, we don't mean it's the equivalent of shouting fire in a crowded theater when in fact there is no fire. It means in any way might adherence to Judaism interfere with one's fully undertaking the responsibilities of a citizen. And Napoleon convenes what's called the Assembly of Jewish Notables, which is sometimes also referred to as Napoleon's Sanhedrin, or the Grand Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin, of course, being the Jewish high court in the times of the Temple, and it's given this name, not to say that this in fact was the Sanhedrin, it's given this name because it's an assembly of Jewish notables who are going to answer a set of questions that are posed to them, in order to answer this question of, can a Jew subscribe to his opinions, to Judaism, and in a way that doesn't manifest disturbance to the public order? Can you be a Jew and a Frenchman? And in fact, we'll see next time when we address this, this will be our first topic next time, what was this assembly of Jewish notables, and then what was the Sanhedrin? The Sanhedrin was essentially the body that rubber stamped the answers of the notables to this set of a dozen questions that Napoleon presented this assembly, trying to get at it. It's actually quite remarkable, some of these questions, the degree to which French society really didn't understand Judaism. Some of the questions are really just factual questions, and these are the questions in the document. If you're interested, you can read ahead and look at it. It's on the Shir's homepage. These questions to Napoleon. The assembly was a combination of Maskilim and traditional Jews and rabbis. We'll talk about that next time. I just want to look. I hope that you'll all be able to continue with us after Pesach when we pick up where we are leaving off, and I hope that we'll make even more progress through the generations of history, and we'll talk about the emancipation of the Jews, and we'll talk about the question of modern anti-Semitism and how that differs from medieval anti-Semitism and how it's an outgrowth of some of these developments. How all of this will, of course, lead to modern Zionism as an answer to the Jewish question. How that leads, of course, to the modern state of Israel. Along the way, the larger questions of how Judaism reforms itself leads to the topic of Reform Judaism, the denominational movement, as well as attempts from within Orthodoxy to reform Judaism, to remake Judaism, while remaining loyal to a conventional notion of halacha. The great leader of that discussion, of course, is Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, and the question of what orthodoxy is and what neo-orthodoxy is, the forebears of what we call modern orthodoxy, how this plays out differently in Europe and what the developments in the United States are. These are some of the topics that we'll continue. I just want to take a moment, again, of course, to thank you all for being part of this discussion. I've enjoyed very much the opportunity to study this with you, and I've enjoyed very much the opportunity to interact with you, and particularly those of you that participate through talking or through chatting or through emailing in the intervening days between the sessions. But I think that we've seen we've seen an array of things that have happened from, let's say, 1648 to 1848. Those are kind of the 200 years that we focused on, although we started a little bit before even. And the remarkable change of the Jewish condition during these 2 centuries, and the sense that one has of standing on the border, with maybe even with 2 toes hanging over the border, of now really leaving the ghetto, and making that move out to the modern world, with all that's involved in that, and all of the repercussions that we now can look back 150 plus years later and see, what's happened. It's just remarkable. It's really just a remarkable journey with so much horror, and yet it's just remarkable to think where the Jewish people are now in 2010 after all of that, or maybe even despite all of that. And it really just gives you pause to stop and think about what we've gone through and what we've achieved and the tasks that stand before us, and to kind of contextualize that is really, I think, just awe-inspiring. In our very first session, we talked about Rabbi Yehuda Chassid and his aliyah, or Rabbi Yehuda Chassid as a proto-Zionist. We mentioned the idea that some would point to him as the opening volley in modern Jewish history. Well, what happens today? They dedicate the Churva synagogue. I trust that you follow the news. If not, get yourself onto a website. The Churva synagogue is Rabbi Yehuda Chassid's synagogue. When he comes on Aliyah to the Old City in the beginning of the 18th century, the very, very beginning of the 18th century, there's a synagogue which is built on the same piece of property which apparently the Ramban, who had come on Aliyah in the 1270s, had made a synagogue. Today there's still a shul there that's called the Beit Knesset HaRamban in the Old City. That synagogue was built by Rabbi Yehuda Chassid. It was destroyed and rebuilt, and it was called the Churva, the destroyed synagogue, because it was rebuilt on the foundation of a destroyed synagogue. That synagogue, the Churva synagogue, served as the great synagogue, the Beit Knesset HaGadol in Yerushalayim, up until 1948, when the Jordanians destroy it again. In 1967, we come back, and it's not rebuilt as a synagogue, but it's left as a kind of archaeological remnant to half-destroyed shul, except for that iconic arch, which is rebuilt and becomes a symbol of modern Jerusalem. And then now, just this week, a new shul's been built and it's been rededicated. It looks, I think, according to the design, is meant to look almost identical to the shul that had existed there up until 1948, which was built on the foundations of the shul of Rebbe Yehuda Chassid, who came in the early 18th century, who came, I think, in 1700, and it's sparking a furor, and it's going to. I hope, God forbid, it doesn't happen. I hope it doesn't happen. God forbid it should happen. That it should create some kind of controversy and some kind of violence because of this, but it becomes the focus of today's news. It's the same Rebbe Yehuda Chassid that we were talking about at the beginning of the session, and here we are on the last day of the series, and we're back to the beginning. We're back to the beginning with the shul, with the churva of Rebbe Yehuda Chassid. So you see that the attempt to understand Jewish history, it's not merely, if you don't understand history, you're doomed to repeat it. If you don't understand history, you don't understand who you are, where you are, what's happening around you. That's true for everyone. It's particularly true for those of us that live with one foot in the present and always one foot in the past, and hopefully with an eye on the future. So, Chag Kosher v'Sameach to everyone. I hope that we will be able to continue learning together after Pesach. Tila, wait, you have a question here. Conservative movement started by Reform Jews who wanted to come back a bit. So the conservative movement, the Reform movement, is a movement that starts in Germany. The conservative movement is a movement that starts in the United States. And it does come about as a corrective on American reform. It does come about as a corrective on American reform. They wanted to literally to conserve some connection to Judaism and to Halakha, which they thought the reform movement at that point was moving away. But we're going to talk about that a little bit as we move along. Okay. If in the meantime you're very interested, again, I'm sure the Wikipedia article on the history of conservative Judaism and the history of Reform Judaism, or certainly the Encyclopedia Judaic article on either of those, will give you any background information that you want. I think generally, just to get the outlines of basic facts, I think that they're generally trustworthy. I think they're generally trustworthy. Again, if you're really just looking for the outlines of basic facts.